This is the Great Vocal Majority Podcast. Hey everybody, this is Tony Contispati and welcome to the Great Vocal Majority Podcast. This is volume 58 that I am entitling The Case Against Donald Trump, ? I woke up this morning and came across an article by Mike Allen and Jim Vandehei on an Axios website called The Public Case Against Trump. I figured I had better read it because if there is a public case against this president, I'd like to know what it is. But I was immediately disappointed. The very first sentence in the article made a false claim. It says, quote, "One thing is true of all major political scandals, : they love their colons. What we know in the moment is but a tiny obscured partial view of the full story later revealed by investigators," unquote. I thought to myself, is there even one case where this was true? The authors claim it has been true of all major political scandals. Yet, when I think back to the mother of all political scandals, Watergate, the American public knew pretty early on that President Nixon was involved. And unlike Watergate, where an office was burglarized and people were arrested, the investigators of Trump and Russia aren't even investigating a crime. They're investigating, hoping to find a crime. Now, there is nothing to compare that to in the previous political scandals. So, right from the jump, Allen and Vandehei want their readers to think all political scandals end in a crescendo of unanticipated revelations. And to me, it sounds like the boys have watched a few too many movies. Anyway, I digress. I soldiered on and I went into the meat and potatoes of their so-called case. Now, Allen and Vandehei go through a list of what they call knowns they believe that should have already ended the Trump presidency. And it's worth addressing each one because it reveals something very disturbing. Allen and Vandehei are desperately trying to keep the Russian collusion fantasy alive when they know there's nothing there, at least at this point, right? The only other alternative is even more disturbing, that both men believe this set of knowns are sufficient grounds upon which to end a presidency and reverse the results of an election. So what's the first known? They say this, quote, "We know Paul Manafort, former Trump campaign chair, has been indicted on 32 counts, including conspiracy and money laundering. We know he made millions off shady Russians and changed the Republican platform to benefit Russia," unquote. Now, Allen and Vandehei fail to point out that the charges against Manafort had nothing at all to do with Russian collusion. They are related to bank and tax fraud charges that were 2 years before Manafort was even involved with the Trump campaign. Now, incidentally, Manafort was only involved with the Trump campaign from June of 2016 to August of 2016, about 3 months. And the New York Times admitted that the charges against Manafort were simply an effort by the Mueller team to pressure him. In fact, the Mueller team has been reprimanded by a trial judge for doing just that. Now, the second known from these two guys says, quote, "We know that the U.S. intelligence community concluded in a report released in January 2017 that Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign in 2016 aimed at the U.S. presidential election to denigrate," that's their word, "Hillary Clinton and with a clear preference for Trump." That's also their words, in quotes. Now, Allen and Vandehei fail to point out key facts here as well. For months, Democrats and their allies in the media, like Allen and Vandehei, were declaring that, quote, "all 17 intel agencies agreed about Russian interference," unquote. Now, this was an intentional falsehood designed to give the public an impression that the full weight of the U.S. intelligence establishment agreed, when 13 agencies didn't even render an opinion and had no interest in weighing in. So it was simply a way to make the case sound more overwhelming than it was. And furthermore, while it was true that Putin and Russia worked to denigrate Clinton, it doesn't necessarily follow that they intended to benefit Trump. That doesn't follow. That canard was perpetrated by James Comey in congressional testimony, who said he saw no other motivation. But simple logic would tell you that the Russians, like everyone else, expected Clinton to win. So their only motivation was to delegitimize her. It just happened by delegitimizing her, they were advancing Trump's cause. We have evidence, anyway, that what I just said here is true, because immediately after Trump won the election, the Russians organized a protest in front of Trump Tower in New York City, and thousands of people showed up. So the preference for Trump by Putin is belied by the fact that his people organized that protest. Now, what's the third known? They say, we know that in May 2016, Trump campaign aide George Papadopoulos told an Australian diplomat Russia had political dirt on Hillary. About 3 weeks earlier, according to the New York Times, Papadopoulos had been told that Moscow had thousands of emails that would embarrass Mrs. Clinton. These were barroom conversations, not evidence of collusion. It would be wise at this point to remember that Hillary Clinton operated a mail server that was so lacking in security, it wasn't even up to date with the regular security patches issued for such servers by Microsoft that are off the shelf and commercially available to anybody in the country. And while official Washington has denied there being any evidence of her email server, that her email server was hacked by a foreign power, a number of former government officials have come forward on the record to state that it is virtually impossible to think that Clinton's server wasn't hacked, because foreign intel agencies continuously attempt to hack the communications of our top officials. Having an unsecured server isn't even a challenge for government-grade hackers. In other words, whatever was said between Papadopoulos and a Russian professor in London is really almost meaningless, because anyone who wanted Clinton's emails had them. Now, the fourth and fifth known I put together. Vandehei and Allen say, we know that in June 2016, Trump's closest aides and family members met at Trump Tower with a shady group of Russians who claimed to have dirt on Hillary. The meeting was billed as part of Russia and its government support for Trump. And we know the Russian lawyer who helped set it up concealed her close ties to Putin's government. Okay, now this meeting that they're referring to here was a big nothing. We all kind of concluded at this point that it was a big nothing. Rather than being evidence of collusion, it actually is evidence that there was no collusion. Because if there was collusion, the meeting would not have been abruptly ended. The Russian attorney with ties to Putin would have come with information on Clinton pointing to that collusion. But she didn't. Some will say that Trump's son and son-in-law attending the meeting were hoping to get information on Clinton. But even if that's true, nobody at the time knew whether she was tied to Putin by their own admission. And the sixth known. Quote, we know that in July of 2016, Trump said, quote, Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 Hillary emails that are missing, unquote, and I urge their publication. Now, here's my comment on this. Of all these so-called knowns, I find this one to really be an embarrassment for Allen and Vandehei. Why? Because if a presidential candidate is going to collude with a hostile foreign power in order to win an election, it would seem that the best way to do that would probably not include something he said during a public campaign speech. Now, anyone who's seen the video of Trump making this speech knows that he was needling the Democrat media, as Trump often does, to the delight of his supporters. The seventh note, quote, "We know that on Air Force One a year later, Trump helped his son, Don Jr., prepare a misleading statement about the meeting. We know top aides freaked out about this." Now, this is water over the dam, too. Donald Trump and his son are both political novices, and whatever they crafted is of no consequence because Donald Trump Jr.'s emails leading up to the meeting with the Russian lawyer have been released to the special counsel and made public. What's the eighth known? Quote from the article, "We know Trump revealed highly classified information to the Russian foreign minister and ambassador in a White House meeting." Quote. Now, actually, we don't know this for a fact. All we know is that an anonymous source to the New York Times revealed this. And even if it occurred, it is neither illegal or an indication of collusion. The president has the authority, by virtue of his office, to declassify anything he wants to declassify. Trump's conversation with Lavrov are not evidence of anything resembling collusion. I mean, how would that even be collusion? Ninth known, quote, "We know that Michael Flynn, former National Security Advisor and close campaign aide, lied to Vice President Pence and the FBI about his Russian-related chats. We know he's now cooperating with the special counsel, and we know Trump initially tried to protect Flynn with loyalty and fervency rarely shown by Trump to others," unquote. Now, what the authors here are not telling you is how these, quote, chats Flynn had were of no consequence because they didn't involve collusion of any kind. Furthermore, people associated with the Flynn case within the FBI have asserted that he did not lie to them, as Allen and Vandehei suggest here. Only James Comey continues to insist he lied to FBI investigators. Even Andrew McCabe, the disgraced second-in-command at the FBI, has said Flynn did not lie to his investigators. Additionally, Flynn is being prosecuted and having his life and reputation destroyed over lies he never told, while Hillary Clinton and her entire team were exonerated and given immunity from prosecution while actually lying to investigators. What's the 10th known? We know during the transition, Jared Kushner spoke with Russian ambassador about establishing a secret communications channel between the Trump transition team and Moscow. We know Kushner omitted previous contacts with Russians on his disclosure forms. Now, here's the key phrase that Vandehei and Allen used. The key phrase is, quote, "during the transition," unquote. There's nothing extraordinary about this. Nothing. Newly elected presidents have their teams of advisors establish lines of communications with other governments all the time. I mean, imagine what this country would look like if they didn't do that. I mean, what, are they going to go in cold on January 20th? They have to open up lines of communication between their teams and foreign governments. It has to happen that way. So really, when you stop and think about this, they're just casting suspicion on something routine that an incoming administration would do. It's really staggering that they would even use this as a known that seems to point towards collusion. The 11th note. They say, we know Trump initially lied about why he fired James Comey, later admitting he was canned because of the, quote, Russia thing. Now, Article 2 of the Constitution makes it very plain. It gives the president broad authority to fire or hire federal agency officials. In the exercise of those duties under Article 2, the president is not required to justify any firings he makes. He can fire James Comey because he thinks he's too tall or that he has bags under his eyes. He can fire James Comey for any reason or for no reason. Therefore, it really doesn't matter why Trump fired him or whatever he said about it, one way or the other. The 12th known. We know Michael Cohen was a close advisor and lawyer, the fixer and secret keeper. We know Trump seethed when the FBI raided Cohen's office. Now, this one really unbelievable. The authors here are being blatantly dishonest by not revealing all the facts. Now, we also know that President Trump was not the only person seething from the raid on Cohen's office. The raid was unnecessarily heavy-handed move, rarely used, especially on cooperating witnesses, as Cohen was, and even more especially, the president's attorney. Former federal prosecutors, DOJ officials, all of them were critical of this action. It's hardly ever used on even organized crime figures, much less presidents. So the question readers of Allen and Vandehei need to ask is, why are these authors not giving you the entire story in this so-called public case? What's the 13th known? We know that in January 2016, just before the Republicans began voting, Michael Cohen tried to restart a Trump Tower project in Moscow. Really? Seriously? Look, this is an incredible overstatement of what actually occurred. Donald Trump had only a non-binding letter of intent that he signed in 2015 regarding real estate development in Russia. A man named Felix Sater, a Russian business associate, kept writing Michael Cohen about getting the project underway. But, and this is important, there's no evidence that Cohen ever responded to those emails. So how in the world can Vandehei and Allen say that Cohen tried to restart a project? It's not Cohen that tried to restart it. It's Felix Sater who tried to get Cohen to start it, but it never happened. It's baffling what these guys are saying and doing. In addition to that, there is also no evidence that Sater ever delivered on any of the promises he made in those emails. So that's according to the New York Times. So what the hell are Allen and Vandehei even talking about? At the 14th and 15th known, we know Mueller questioned Russian oligarch who made payments to Cohen, who used the money to pay off a porn star who allegedly had an affair with Trump. We know that oligarch was a bad enough dude that the Trump administration sanctioned him. Well, I don't want to say nothing, but why would you sanction him if you're colluding with him? But let's start there. But the whole thing is pure speculation. The Russian oligarch being referred to is a man named Viktor Vekselberg. He was in attendance at the same dinner which Michael Flynn and others were seated with Vladimir Putin. Also in attendance at that dinner was Jill Stein, who later said that Putin just sat down for a photo op, wasn't even introduced to the people sitting at the table. You probably didn't hear about that, especially if you watch CNN or MSNBC. Now, if Vekselberg is such an ally of Trump, it's kind of hard to explain why Trump would sanction him, isn't it? It should be clear from this incredibly slanted article that Allen and Vandehei have staked their reputation on Russian collusion story, and they are desperately grasping at straws, using selected facts, speculation, mixed characterization, and other things like that to mislead the public. Now, this is not to say that there was no Russian collusion. I'm only saying that what they're pointing to is not evidence of it. Now, here are a few facts we actually do know that pertain to collusion with Russians that we know and nobody's really arguing with. We know that within 24 hours of the election, the Hillary Clinton campaign team talked about floating the idea that Russian interference was responsible for her defeat. This was mentioned in the book memorializing the Clinton campaign, written by two liberal reporters, Jonathan Allen and Amy Parnes. It's called Shattered: Inside Hillary Clinton's Doomed Campaign. We also know that the Clinton campaign shelled out millions of dollars to acquire what has come to be known as the Russian dossier, generally regarded as a fraudulent document. It was relied upon to acquire a FISA warrant to spy on the Trump campaign and the transition. The FBI never interviewed the sources of the claims in the dossier, as is their normal practice. And we also know that Hillary Clinton maintained an email server that was unsecured, as I mentioned earlier, that was a direct violation of several statutes and her duties as Secretary of State, for which she suffered no legal penalty. We know that the former director of the CIA, Michael Hayden, who was also the former director of the National Security Agency, and a number of others have said it's virtually impossible to think that Hillary Clinton's mail server wasn't breached by a multitude of hostile governments. We also know that John Podesta, Clinton's campaign chairman, and his brother in the Podesta Group lobbied on behalf of Russia. We also know that Clinton destroyed numerous electronic devices, which could have been mined for evidence against her. We also know that the people leading the FBI investigation of Clinton were anti-Trump, pro-Clinton partisans. We know that the FBI investigators broke with their standards and practices by permitting all of Clinton's staff to be represented by a single attorney, which gave them the opportunity to coordinate their testimony. And that's exactly why they're never really allowed to do that, because you don't want witnesses or suspects to be able to coordinate their testimony. And so so they can't uncover inconsistencies and lies. We know that the Russian entities that donated in excess of $150 million to the Clinton Family Foundation during the same time frame when Hillary Clinton's State Department approved the Uranium One deal, which ultimately resulted in Russian control of 20% of American uranium ore resources. We know that since the Uranium One deal, those same Russian entities haven't given a dime to the Clinton Foundation. We know that James Comey wrote an exoneration letter for Clinton months before she and her team were actually interviewed. I could go on, but the point has been made here more than sufficiently. Hillary Clinton not only colluded with Russians against Trump, she also was a key player in policy decisions that allowed Russia to have access to strategic nuclear materials and benefited financially from it, even if only by coincidence, but certainly warranting as deep an investigation as anything Trump is alleged to have done. To make matters even worse, it appears that high-ranking officials in the Obama administration, DOJ, and the FBI conspired to exonerate Clinton of any wrongdoing, expecting her to win the election, even though it was clear she had broken the law. Look, people like Allen and Vandehei don't even see this as an issue anymore. But their attitude is prevalent throughout the media, and it is precisely why growing numbers of Americans, people like you and me, just don't believe them anymore and have stopped taking them seriously as impartial reporters. For the great vocal majority, I'm Tony Codispati. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks. Take care.